Hello, everybody. It's me, Fee, or Fiona Timms, otherwise known as White Zulu, author of my autobiography of the same name. And I welcome you all to another chapter from my book. I do hope you're all enjoying my life story. And I must thank all of you for being such dedicated subscribers, especially those who write such complimentary messages below my videos. They are much appreciated. I would like to point out that the previous South African flag hanging on the wall behind me is not a political statement. It is simply a piece of history in the background of my first 50 years of life, being born and growing up in my beloved mother country, South Africa. My autobiography, White Zulu, is not a political commentary and frankly describes my experiences of growing up with the Zulu tribe as my family. That flag is simply a piece of cloth signifying the history of South Africa. It was originally used by the Union of South Africa from 1928 to 1961, when I was 11 years old, and later the Republic of South Africa until 1994. This week, it's finishing school part 5, and in fact, this is when I leave Switzerland to go to London. And from the feedback I've had, you also want to hear about my London exploits and general time with my cousins in England. So we will have it. I will give it to you. And this piece is called Finishing School, Part 5. I had one weekend left with the Henchoz, and after another interminably dull week at Fontanet, I packed up all my belongings, including the records. I didn't feel that the girls in the common room deserved them. They treated me with such contempt all the time I was at the place. And anyway, for all I cared, if they wanted records, they could go and steal them. I left Fontanet without a backward glance. Only Mr. Savage came out of his office briefly to say goodbye, and I dodged his clammy embrace and slobbery kisses by sticking out my hand in a very English manner and shook his damp, limp one briskly. I felt I owed the Savages nothing. I had a very strong suspicion that they'd simply had a magnificent brochure printed, probably copied from another of the many finishing schools in that area. I'd even seen skiing promised in that brochure, along with photos of glamorous-looking girls in ski outfits posing on snow somewhere. When I'd excitedly asked Jane, the second day of my term there, where they skied, she looked at me blankly for a bit, before saying she didn't even own a pair of skis and had never attempted the sport. She'd been at Fontanet since the beginning of January, a month before the time I'd arrived at Chateau d'Ay. A month after. Maria just shrugged and shook her head, saying something incomprehensible in her broken English. There was horse riding offered, but when I'd asked Monsieur Savage about that, he'd told me it would cost my parents extra, as they recommended I use a riding school just outside Vevey. It certainly wasn't included, nor were most of the other tempting advertisements of flower arranging, modelling, and excursions to other towns, and places of interest part of the curriculum. Each activity was an extra, and if I wanted to do any of them, I'd have to write to Dad and ask his permission, giving him the costs of whatever it was I wanted to do. In return, he'd have to telephone or write to the Savages and give his consent, and then send them a large cheque to pay for it. I was so bored once that I took a chance and, going through the procedures, asked Dad if I could go on a ride, telling him what the price of a morning out on horseback would cost him. His reply, when it eventually came, was short and succinct. I could buy a decent polo pony for that. Forget it. I felt that the entire 5 months I'd spent at the so-called finishing school had been a complete rip-off for my parents, and I'd had a miserable time there, wasting precious months I could have spent with the Henchoz family. As I only spoke French there and had seen and learnt far more from Pierre's excursions, as well as plenty of Switzerland's history and politics from Silette and Monsieur, I'd learned nothing but bad habits at the school. Once I was back in Chateau d'Ay, I had to quickly return all Mum's skiing equipment, clothes, and, sadly, my precious black fur sheepskin-lined boots to the Buxton's loft and say goodbye to them. Pierre insisted on driving me all the way down to Geneva Airport, as he wanted to see me off there, rather than put me on the train as my parents had arranged. The Henchoz hadn't charged 1 penny to Mum and Dad for all the extra weekends and occasional little holidays I'd spent with them, and had treated me like one of the family. With the little time I had left, I tried my best to get a chance to see Louis and me again. I told Silette I wanted to say goodbye to him, and where would I find him? "Oh, he's back at his barracks in the army again," she said casually. "He left with his horses a few weeks ago. I saw my sister the other day, and she told me he'd gone." I was so disappointed, but realized that, realistically, I couldn't have done more than peck him goodbye on the cheek, as Pierre was shadowing every step I took now, and I would have had to take him with me to show me where Louis Amy's grandfather's farm was, as Silette would have said. As if I didn't know. In reality, I could have walked there in my sleep, and with Pierre at my side, possibly holding my hand. Actually, probably. It would have been torment for me to have to act casually in saying goodbye to the love of my life. We cried as we said our goodbyes, and once again I embraced la vieille tête and slipped her a carton of her favourite Gauloise. I promised to keep in touch from England via postcard, and then Pierre took me to Geneva Airport, where we made our farewells, with plenty of promises to write regularly and stay in touch. After our last kiss, I left him standing sadly, waving to me as I disappeared through the departures gate. He talked to me about meeting up with me sometime, somehow in London, once I'd found my feet and had decided where, or indeed whether, I was to be living there permanently. The next leg of my overseas adventure was very much a new and unknown experience to me. Gary was at Heathrow to meet me, dear, faithful Gary, who'd made plans to come over to Europe to coincide with the end of my term at Fontenette. Originally, he'd wanted to come over a bit sooner so that we could ski together on Les Diablés, which I'd told him about in my sporadic postcards to him in Johannesburg, where he was at Wits University. He was an excellent skier, having spent almost every year since he'd been about 10 years old, skiing somewhere in Europe with his parents and sister during the long summer school holidays. Like my parents, his mum and dad spent every European winter skiing in some well-known resort, sometimes in France and other times in Switzerland. But unlike mine, they'd taken their 2 children with them every time. And even though his younger sister, for reasons best known to herself, didn't ski at all, Mum and Dad had even joined Gary's family on their skiing trips and spent several weeks together, saying how well he skied. Gary had never been to Gstaad. It was out of even his parents' price range, but I'd raved about the all-year-round skiing available there. And he was very keen to come over for a week or so, ski with me, and then we could both fly to London together. This plan had sounded wonderful, except that I was stuck at the school during the week, and he would have had to wait for a weekend, staying somewhere extremely expensive, as Vevey was a very upmarket town, until I was free for the weekend. Then there was another problem. The Savages would never allow me to go off for the weekend with a single young man. Neither could I ask Dad's permission to allow them to let me. I certainly couldn't ask him if I could go off skiing unchaperoned with Gary. That left the Henchoz, which was also a tricky situation, as I was now Pierre's girlfriend and wouldn't look at all good if I suddenly asked if my South African boyfriend could come and stay and take me skiing. Nor could he stay in a pension in Châteaudet and wait for me to be free from Pierre. It was all too fraught with insurmountable problems. So, in spite of the fact that I'd been longing to ski with Gary and show off my skills in French as well, I persuaded him to meet me in London. He was terribly disappointed, but I insisted that the school would never let me out with him, nor would Dad, and I kept absolutely quiet about the Henchoz family, not daring to tell them that I had an open invitation there, but made it sound as if it had been just a few occasions I'd been invited up to Châteaudet to ski during the summer term. It hadn't felt like I was cheating on Gary, as I'd never been mad about Pierre and felt he was more like an older brother to me than anything else. But what had changed was my passionate love for Louis Ami. I was still smitten. How was I going to shake off that aching longing I permanently carried around with me now that I was back with Gary? Too many boyfriends. It just doesn't work. There he was, waiting excitedly at the arrivals gate, and took my incredibly heavy suitcase from me after we'd embraced and kissed passionately on seeing each other after so long. He'd been my boyfriend since I was 16, and the very first boyfriend I ever had. Lovely guy. He'd bought himself a little second-hand car, a Lancia Fulvia Coupe, a smart sports car, and had also acquired himself some digs in Earl's Court that he shared with a couple of other young South African guys, other Michael House schoolmates. At that time, Earl's Court was nicknamed Kangaroo Alley, as people used to say that if you shouted "Bruce" at the top of your voice, about 20 heads would pop out of doors and windows all up and down the streets in that district. By prior arrangement, once they knew I'd be in England, the Barnbys had invited me to spend some time with them. Henry Barnby was related to us on Dad's side, and he had a beautiful big flat at Rivermead Court in Ranelagh Gardens, overlooking the River Thames. As Gary drove me through this incredible city, I gasped at all the enormous buildings we passed. "Is that Buckingham Palace?" I asked. "Is that London Bridge?" It was all so familiar looking in a strange way. I suppose because I'd spent my school years seeing these famous landmarks and buildings in pictures and films. I definitely felt as if I'd been there before, as it all looked so familiar. Déjà vu. Gary patiently told me what little he knew of the landmarks, as he wasn't very well acquainted with London either, having only been there a week or so himself. But he kindly took me around Piccadilly Circus, so I could see the famous brightly lit neon Coca-Cola and Bovril signs, and past the palace, so that I could get a glimpse in through the great big iron gates, decorated with the royal coat of arms picked out in gold leaf. It was all so exciting to me after the tiny village of Châteaudet, and I kept breaking into French, as I'd almost forgotten I spoke English. I'd been dreaming in French for many months now, and didn't realize I was speaking it until Gary, laughing, replied in his excellent French, and then we both burst into laughter. We arrived at the house in Kangaroo Alley, and Gary introduced me to his two housemates. We were all going to watch the film The Road to Hong Kong, starring Bob Hope, Bing Crosby, and Joan Collins, made in 1962, and which was the last in the long-running Road to series, which was showing as an old rerun on television that evening. Gary had set the whole evening's entertainment up especially for me, and was going to drop me off at the Barnbys' flat after the movie ended. I rang my Uncle Henry to tell him I'd arrived and to ask directions to their flat. And then we settled down to a delightful evening of eating fish and chips out of newspaper while watching the film in black and white. Afterwards, Gary dropped me off at the Barnbys to a very warm welcome, and I waved him goodbye for the time being, having no idea of what the Barnbys had planned for me. I was given a pretty and extremely comfortable spare room to myself and was reintroduced to the family. Henry was a second cousin of Dad's, and so utterly different from him that you wouldn't believe they were even remotely related. Audrey was his wife, and Miles, 18, was almost exactly my age. Frances, his younger sister, was 15. I felt immediately at home with them. I was thrilled to find that I'd been invited down to spend a week or two at Radcliffe, the family home of another set of English cousins. That is all for the time being. and there's more to come next week. I would like to thank John Moslane for putting aside his Friday afternoons to help me produce these videos. Without him, I could not do this. I would also like to thank Sean van Vuren for his sterling work in uploading my videos to my YouTube channel, adding the photos, as well as managing my channel so professionally. If you would like to know more about my other works, I have written 5 books in all, and each one is autobiographical. Please visit my website at www.whitezulubook.com, where you will find a lot more information as well as plenty of photographs. Thank you so much for listening. I hope you enjoyed my life story, and there is plenty more to come. A thumbnail photo will be attached each week, and thank you so much for all your support and all the very kind remarks you make in complimenting me on my work. I really appreciate it. Goodbye.